Welcome back to the channel, everyone. Wishing you all a warm and peaceful day. What happens when a proud CEO willingly drops to his knees in a leaky room, crying and begging the woman he loves to stop hiding their child? Faced with James's absolute exhaustion, will Diep's defensive walls completely crumble? Or will the terrifying shadow of Chairman Juan force her to cruelly push his hand away once more? Before we find out the answer, please take a quick second to leave a comment letting me know what city or country you're tuning in from. I truly appreciate all your love and support. And now, let's step right into today's story. The roaring thunder tore through the gray sky outside the fishing village, but inside the cramped, rented room, everything sank into a suffocating silence. On the cold cement floor, a puddle of hot ginger tea spilled from the shattered plastic cup was still letting off thin wisps of steam, blending with the room's musty smell. The ocean wind howled through the cracks in the corrugated tin window, blowing against Diep's thin sweater. How much longer were you planning to hide my child? And grit your teeth through this misery alone, Diep? James's question wasn't loud, and his voice was hoarse and broken, yet it carried a devastating force that struck straight into Diep's heart. Diep sat in dead silence on the rickety bamboo bed. Her wide, tear-filled eyes stared blankly at the man kneeling on one knee right in front of her. Her breathing grew ragged. All this time, ever since she stood by James's hospital bed and bit her lip to make that cruel promise to Chairman Juan, she had forced herself to become an impenetrable fortress. She forced herself not to cry, forced herself to swallow bowls of watery porridge that burned her throat only to throw it all back up, and forced herself to get used to the fishy stench of the port. She was convinced she could quietly give birth, raise their child alone in the shadows, and silently watch him live a peaceful and successful life from afar. But that impenetrable fortress completely shattered the second she saw the state James was in right now. The man who always appeared so proud and composed was now right in front of her, looking utterly exhausted. His clothes were soaked and plastered with mud. His deep eyes were bloodshot from pure exhaustion. His sharp face was visibly gaunt, and his large, sturdy hands were now trembling as they rested on her cheeks, freezing cold from the rain. How many emotional storms had he weathered? How many street corners had he scoured to find his way to this run-down place? All her pent-up emotions, the self-pity from her agonizing morning sickness, and the unbearable longing suddenly surged like a broken dam. Diep no longer cared about any promises. In this moment, she was just a vulnerable woman, desperately craving the warmth of the man she loved. "James!" The name stood up, opening his strong arms to catch him. James instantly stood up, opening his strong arms to catch her small frame, pulling her tightly into his heaving chest. Their embrace wasn't romantic like in the movies. It was a clumsy, messy, desperate, and tear-soaked hug between two people who had just found their other half again. Diep buried her face in the crook of his neck, her arms wrapping around his broad, rain-soaked back, gripping his shirt tightly as if terrified he would vanish the moment she let go. She broke down, crying. No longer holding back her sobs, she cried her heart out. Her hot, heartbroken tears soaked right through his collar. "Why are you like this? How did you even find this place?" Diep cried and hiccuped, her words broken and shattered in the rain. James didn't answer right away. He buried his face deep into her hair, greedily breathing in the familiar scent he had been craving like a madman. His chest shook violently. The tears of a man who had coldly faced the most ruthless corporate battles were now falling without hesitation, soaking Diep's thin sweater. "I found you." James's voice was hoarse, his words carrying an indescribable agony. He tightened his grip just a little, enough for her to feel his presence. Why are you so cruel to yourself? Why make yourself and our child suffer like this? Standing in the cramped kitchenette, Diep's mother quietly reached up to wipe a tear rolling down her cheek. She didn't say a word, just turned around to pick up the pieces of the broken plastic cup on the floor, then took a step back, leaving some privacy for the two kids clinging to each other like drowning people who had just found a lifeline. They held each other like that for a long time, ignoring the storm howling outside the tin roof. It wasn't until James felt the body in his arms shivering slightly from the cold of his wet clothes that his protective instincts kicked back in. He gently loosened his embrace, supporting Diep's thin shoulders, and carefully pushed her back a little to get a clear look at her face. "You're freezing," James frowned, his tone laced with infinite sorrow. He took her wrists, gently pulled her back, and carefully sat her down on the edge of the rickety bamboo bed. Then James slowly stood up straight. Now, with a wider view, he finally had the chance to closely observe the place where Diep had been sheltering for the past month. James's chest tightened once more, aching as if someone was crushing it. The room was incredibly shabby and suffocating. The plastered walls were peeling, stained with yellow watermarks. The air was thick with the fishy stench of the sea. The meal on the plastic table in the corner was just a half-eaten bowl of watery, plain porridge. James sat down next to her. The bamboo bed let out a heavy creak. Diep lowered her head slightly, her hands clasped together on her lap. She wasn't avoiding him. It was just that the overwhelming feeling of self-pity and exhaustion left her speechless. He reached out, incredibly carefully and tenderly, pressing his large palm against Diep's still flat lower belly. The warmth from his hand passed through her clothes, bringing a strange, comforting sense of safety. What if... James paused for a beat, his Adam's apple bobbing with difficulty. What if I hadn't stopped by to visit your mother this weekend like always? What if I hadn't realized she was gone and forced the truth out of Thao? How much longer were you planning to hide this from me? Hearing his heartbroken voice, Diep's eyes stung again. She gently placed her hand over his on her belly, her voice paper-thin. I didn't want to hide it from you forever, but I had no other choice. Your father was right. Your path ahead is still so long. I couldn't let you lose your future because of me. Diep's honest and selfless explanation felt like a knife carving out a piece of James's heart. This small girl always chose to take the short end of the stick, just to protect his peace. James turned his hand over, enveloping Diep's ice-cold hands. He squeezed her hands tightly, passing all his unwavering resolve to her. Please, never take it upon yourself to push me out of your life ever again, he whispered, his deep eyes filled with nothing but love. Outside, the thunder had faded, leaving only the sound of rain pattering on the tin roof. The atmosphere in the room was no longer frantic, replaced instead by a deep sense of understanding and connection. James gently wiped away a tear lingering on Diep's pale cheek. His voice became clear and warm. Listen to me, Diep. You were afraid my father would use his power to pressure me to take away everything I have, but you forgot that I'm not some young kid just stepping into the world for him to easily control. Diep looked up at him, listening intently. For a long time now, ever since you left and I couldn't find you, I buried myself in work, not to rebel or overthrow my father, but just to prove my true capabilities to him. James smiled, a calm, confident smile. I personally negotiated and brought in 3 major projects for the corporation. The board of directors currently has absolute faith in my leadership. My voice now rests on my own merits, not on his arranged marriages. He is a seasoned businessman. He knows perfectly well that keeping a capable son is far more important than forcing a meaningless marriage. With every word Diep heard, the anxiety in her heart melted away. She knew James's character. He always handled things with maturity and courage, never choosing extreme confrontation that would hurt his family. James squeezed her hand gently, his eyes suddenly becoming incredibly tender. I set up a private financial fund, completely independent of my family, and I used it to buy that plot of land on the hill in the suburbs. Diep blinked, a faint smile unconsciously tugging at the corners of her lips, mixed with a hint of emotion. She softly interrupted him. I already know about the tea hill. James paused, surprised. You know? Did your mom tell you? Diep shook her head slightly, her eyes reddening again. She looked straight at him, her voice cracking with emotion. Mom did tell me. But I also saw you. That day while I was washing dishes at the diner. I saw your interview on TV. I heard you mention the tea hill and I knew you were still waiting for me. James was speechless. His chest throbbed with a mix of heartache and happiness. So, even in this dark corner of the world, his little girl had always been quietly watching over him. He reached out and gently stroked her hair, his eyes overflowing with adoration. You heard all that, and you still had the heart to hide from me so well? James smiled, a rare, warm smile that chased away the cold of the leaky room. But I didn't say everything on TV, and your mother has only seen the tea hill. There's a secret, and it's also a gift I made just for you. Diep looked confused, her wide eyes staring at him. What else is there? Right in the middle of the tea hill, where it gets the most sunlight, I had a wooden house built. James's warm voice slowly painted a peaceful picture right before her eyes. A very cozy oak house with a spacious yard and a small garden for you to grow fresh vegetables. The floors are carefully insulated so your feet won't get cold walking around in the winter. Diep almost stopped breathing. Her heart skipped a beat. Her eyes welled up with tears again. She had never asked him for anything, nor had she ever painted him a dream of a wooden house. All these meticulous, sweet details were entirely his own doing, his own desire to give her the most peaceful sanctuary. That's the safe haven I built with my own hands for our little family. The air there is fresh, perfect for your pregnancy. James looked down at her belly, his eyes filled with the longing of a father. Come home with me. Come back so I can cook porridge for you myself whenever you're sick, so I can rub your back every sleepless night. Give me the chance to make it up to you and take care of both of you. Okay? That simple yet profoundly sincere confession made the final barrier in Diep's heart completely crumble. Tears of happiness began to roll down her cheeks. However, the lingering fear from all this time still made her hesitate a little. Diep bit her lower lip, her voice sniffling, her eyes still reflecting a hint of worry. But what about your father? What if he finds out you're shielding me and makes things difficult? I'm so scared. Right as the internal struggle was rising inside Diep, a warm, rough hand gently rested on her shoulder from behind. It was Diep's mother. She had been standing there listening to the whole conversation. She stepped forward, gently patting her daughter's trembling shoulder. Her wrinkled face broke into a forgiving, sympathetic smile. Diep, listen to James, honey. Her mother's voice was deep and warm, bringing boundless comfort. I've lived a long time. I don't judge people wrong. I can endure a little hardship, but I can't bear to see you pregnant, so sick you're pale and yellow, having to live in this damp place. This place isn't good for you, and it's not good for the baby. Diep's mother looked up at James. Her eyes no longer held the wariness or distance they once did, leaving only complete trust. James's love for you, his determination for you, I believe it's strong enough to keep both of you safe. Hearing those words from her mother's heart, seeing the deep exhaustion etched into the corners of her mother's eyes, and above all, looking into James's eyes, blazing with an unshakable love, Diep's heart was finally set free. Marked the end of her days on the run. Okay, I'll come home with you. That was all he needed to hear. All the tension and exhaustion on James's face were instantly swept away. A radiant, overwhelmingly happy smile lit up the CEO's sharp face. He leaned in, carefully lifting her chin, and pressed a deep, tender kiss to her sweaty forehead, as if sealing his eternal protection over her. "Thank you. Thank you for trusting me," he whispered. Instantly, the demeanor of a decisive man returned. He wouldn't allow Diep and their child to stay in this miserable place for another second. James let go of her and stood up straight. He didn't care about his soaking wet clothes, rolling his sleeves up past his elbows. "You and Diep just sit and rest. I'll pack up the things." James turned and said to Diep's mother with a clear, respectful voice, "My car is parked right on the main road. We're leaving this afternoon." With that, James bent down and picked up the worn-out duffel bag in the corner of the room. He carefully gathered every thin sweater, every piece of Diep's worn clothing, and folded them neatly into the bag. The sight of a CEO in muddy leather shoes, clumsily but incredibly carefully packing his wife's belongings in a leaky room, suddenly became a strangely beautiful and heartwarming picture. Outside, the rain was gradually stopping. The storm had receded into the background, making way for a peaceful journey waiting for them ahead. Guys, honestly, reading the final lines of today's episode gave me a real sigh of relief. The image of the CEO rolling up his sleeves, ignoring his mud-soaked clothes to personally fold his wife's old shirts, is just so incredibly heartwarming and beautiful. No need for fancy, empty promises. A peaceful wooden house on a sunlit tea hill is James's strongest commitment. How do you guys feel about the way James turned the tables on his father and built a safe haven for Diep with his own hands? Will their life on the tea hill be peaceful forever? Or will Chairman Juan soon discover this shocking secret? I'm really looking forward to hearing all your feelings and predictions. I'll definitely be reading and hearting everyone's comments and thoughts. If today's storyline helped heal your heart, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell to join James and Diep on their next journey. Thank you so much, and I'll catch you all in the next video.